In the dead of winter 1941-42, on the ice-choked plains of the Eastern Front, tank crews stood shivering beside their machines. Enemy anti-tank rifles and artillery rounds were tearing through armor like paper. And then, something extraordinary happened. A radical, ad hoc trick that turned their tanks into temporary, bulletproof fortresses. Imagine pouring buckets of water over a tank at midnight, letting it freeze solid into a shell of ice and snow, and then watching rounds glance off that frozen crust. It sounds impossible, but it worked, at least for a time. Today, we're going to uncover how this bizarre ice armor technique came about, how it was built, how it held up in combat, and how it ultimately failed. Why did desperate crews resort to using ice as armor? What does it tell us about innovation in the face of overwhelming odds? Stay tuned, because not only is this one of the strangest survival stories of World War II, but it also asks a chilling question. When your steel armor won't protect you, can mere frozen water keep you alive? If you love uncovering forgotten wartime hacks like this, hit subscribe now, so you don't miss the next deep dive into how human ingenuity fought the cold and the enemy. The year was 1941. The German invasion, Operation Barbarossa, had pushed deep into Soviet territory. As autumn turned to winter, the conditions grew brutal. Roads vanished under snow, rivers froze, engines choked, and transport convoys stuttered to a halt. Tank crews and infantry alike faced one of the worst winters Europe had seen in decades. On the Eastern Front, the cold wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a weapon. Lubricants froze, tracks snapped, engines refused to start. Meanwhile, German anti-tank guns and rifles were becoming increasingly effective. The armor on many Soviet machines, designed for the clashes of 1939-40, was now proving inadequate against more powerful rounds. In these conditions, crews found themselves caught between two deadly forces, not just the enemy, but the freezing air itself. And from this crucible of desperation, a strange idea began to emerge. If conventional armor was failing, maybe something else could step in. Something cheap, something abundant, something frozen. Because when you are freezing in the dark, in a hideout near the front, improvisation isn't luxury, it's survival. As the winter deepened, Soviet tank crews began to notice something strange happening to their vehicles. Tanks that had sat overnight, half buried in snow and frozen mud, developed a tough, glassy crust along their hulls. At first, it was just a nuisance. Crews had to break off sheets of ice with hammers before they could even climb inside. But then came the moment of discovery. One morning, a group of infantrymen approaching a frozen tank fired a few test shots at the hull, more out of curiosity than anything else. Instead of punching clean holes or leaving deep scars, the bullets skidded off the iced surface. To the soldiers' amazement, the rounds fragmented or lost their trajectory the moment they struck the frozen layer. Word spread fast. Could this be replicated? Was it a fluke? Tank commanders were skeptical. After all, how could ice, something fragile and brittle, possibly help against projectiles traveling hundreds of meters per second? Yet the evidence was right there in front of them. This natural frozen shell hid something. It didn't make the tank invulnerable, but it altered how bullets interacted with the surface. The real question became, if nature could do this accidentally, what would happen if they tried doing it deliberately? Crews began experimenting. Buckets of water poured over the glossus plates. Layers of snow packed around turrets. At night, in 30 to cold, even the smallest amount of moisture would freeze into a hard, gleaming crust. A frozen prototype of the ice armor was born. Not out of theory, but out of desperation and improvisation. Once the idea took hold, Soviet crews didn't hesitate. They turned to the simplest possible resource: water. Every tank battalion had access to barrels, buckets, and pumps, and the freezing temperatures did the rest. At night, under complete blackout conditions, crews began a new ritual. First, they cleaned the hull of snow and loose frost. Then they poured the first layer of water, thin, controlled, meant only to create a base film. After 15 minutes, a second coat, then a third, thicker one. In total, some tanks accumulated several centimeters of ice, forming a shell that wrapped the hull, turret, gun mantlet, and even the track guards. To get even stronger results, some crews packed wet snow onto the armor and let it freeze into a dense, compact mass. Others mixed mud with water to create a frozen composite with higher density. To modern eyes, the idea seems absurd, but the physics is surprisingly sound. Why did it work? Ice disrupts the stability of small-caliber bullets. The slick, frozen surface causes projectiles to deflect at shallow angles. The layered ice absorbs and spreads out kinetic energy instead of letting it transfer directly to the steel. Frozen mud added mass, acting almost like a crude spaced armor layer. Small arms fire, rifles, submachine guns, even some light machine guns lost much of their effect. Was it a miracle? No, but it bought time. It made the difference between a bullet punching in and a bullet glancing off. In war, that's enough to change who lives through the next minute. Commanders couldn't ignore what they were seeing. Field reports described tanks surviving close-range fire from infantry that normally would have immobilized or damaged them. And so, the strange, improvised battlefield invention known unofficially as Ledinoy Panzer, the ice armor, became more than a trick. It became a tactical tool. The real test of the ice armor didn't come in workshops, supply yards, or quiet forest hideouts. It came under fire. In early January, a Soviet reconnaissance group reported German infantry moving toward a frozen ravine, where several iced-up tanks were concealed. These tanks were not fully operational. Two had engine issues, one had a damaged idler wheel. They were vulnerable, but they were also coated in several layers of ice and packed snow, applied the night before. As the Germans approached, they opened fire. Rifle and machine gun rounds snapped against the tanks' hulls, but instead of punching through or chipping steel, the bullets glanced off, spraying shards of ice into the air. The sound was different too, a dull thud, almost like hitting wet wood. The infantry expected these tanks to respond or withdraw. Instead, they simply sat there, silent and inert, refusing to show weakness. The frost made them look like abandoned relics or frozen statues. The Germans hesitated. When reinforcements arrived, the Soviet crews climbed inside, coaxed the engines to life, and rolled out, still wearing their shimmering, icy armor like phantoms rising from the snow. Reports from this engagement spread through the battalions like wildfire. Crews began applying ice layers more regularly. The idea moved from improvisation to routine. But there was another unexpected outcome, something even the crews hadn't foreseen. A tank coated in ice was quieter. The frozen shell absorbed engine vibrations and muffled noise, making the tanks harder to detect at range. Combined with snow-dampened terrain, these armored vehicles became, in the words of one Soviet officer, "Nochny prizriki," night ghosts. The ice didn't make them invincible, but it changed the dynamic of winter combat. Even temporary advantages mattered, and in the brutal arithmetic of the Eastern Front, any edge could tip the scale between survival and annihilation. With every new tactic come side effects, some helpful, some dangerous. The first and most obvious advantage of iced armor was visual. A tank coated in frost blended seamlessly with the snowy landscape. Sharp silhouettes turned into soft, white shapes. Turret lines and hull contours disappeared under layers of rime. Camouflage that normally required paint or whitewash now came naturally. But there were other, less obvious consequences. Inside the vehicles, temperatures dropped even further. Tanks were already freezing boxes of steel. Adding a shell of ice around them turned the interiors into walk-in freezers. Operators described frost forming on the walls, on their equipment, even on their gloves. Ventilation became an issue too. Hatches that froze shut were not a rare occurrence. Some crews had to beat them open from the inside with crowbars. In extreme cases, a tank could become what soldiers grimly referred to as le Danois Grobe, an ice coffin. Yet the most striking unintended effect was psychological. German infantry who encountered these tanks described them as eerie, silent, almost supernatural. The ice muffled sound. It refracted light. It gave the machines an unnatural gloss under the moonlight, making them look like sculptures rather than combat vehicles. And because the Germans couldn't easily tell if a frozen tank was abandoned or active, they hesitated. That hesitation bought the Soviet crews precious seconds, sometimes enough to turn an ambush or reposition for counterfire. Ice armor wasn't perfect. It didn't stop anti-tank rifles. It didn't stop larger guns, and it definitely couldn't protect against artillery. But it didn't need to. All it had to do was blunt the first volley, confuse the enemy, disrupt their targeting, and give the crew inside a chance to fight back. In a war defined by inches and seconds, that was priceless. Once word spread that ice armor could deflect small arms fire and give tanks a stealth edge, the question wasn't if crews would adopt it. It was how fast they could do it. By midwinter 1941-42, the trick had moved beyond isolated improvisation. Entire battalions began developing routines to ice up their tanks. Water trucks, normally assigned to field kitchens or sanitation, were redirected to assist tank brigades. The process moved from chaotic experimentation to a semi-formal nightly ritual. At dusk, water barrels were rolled out. At night, crews lined up buckets, hoses, and ladles. And by dawn, the vehicles stood encased in a frozen shell, ghostly shapes under the pale blue morning light. It wasn't standardized doctrine. There was no official manual, no engineering officer supervising the thickness of ice layers. But the Red Army's strength often lay in its ability to decentralize quick solutions. Commanders might not have ordered the practice directly, but few stopped it. They couldn't argue with results. Mechanics also adapted. Some units built makeshift frames to help distribute water more evenly over sloped armor. Others packed pre-frozen slabs of snow and ice onto vulnerable spots like the turret ring or hull machine gun port. Soldiers described the scene as a factory line on ice. Steam rising from hot water, dark silhouettes of men against flood lamps, buckets clanging, the metallic groan of freezing steel. This wasn't just creativity. It was necessity forged under winter conditions that killed more reliably than bullets, and it marked the moment when ice armor evolved from a quirk of nature into a battlefield technique. As the winter wore on, the ice armor technique grew more inventive. Crews realized that pure ice, while effective, wasn't always enough. So they began modifying and upgrading it, creating crude yet surprisingly effective composite designs. One variant combined ice with snow. Snow, when compacted and soaked, froze into a dense, chalky material that adhered better to sloped armor. It added thickness without adding too much weight. Another variant added mud. The mud and water mixture froze into a harder, heavier shell, almost like primitive spaced armor. When bullets hit, they transferred their energy into the frozen mass rather than the steel beneath. In extreme cases, tank crews even sculpted frozen ridges and protrusions on their hulls. These worked like improvised deflector angles, encouraging bullets to ricochet rather than bite in. But the innovation didn't stop with tanks. Infantry units noticed the benefits and adapted the principle to fortifications. Machine gun nests, trenches, and log bunkers were coated with water at night, turning them into ice-reinforced defensive works. In some sectors, anti-tank ditches were lined with ice to prevent collapsing. The Finns had used similar ideas in the Winter War. Now, the Soviets scaled it up, integrating frozen materials into ad hoc winter engineering. It wasn't official doctrine, but it was battlefield wisdom, passed from soldier to soldier, learned through bitter cold and constant pressure. Perhaps the most striking effect of these innovations was camouflage. A tank covered in frozen snow became indistinguishable from a mound of drifts. A bunker coated in ice became a glimmering shape that refracted moonlight and disappeared into the landscape. Ice armor wasn't just protection, it was concealment, deception, and psychological warfare, all crystallized into a few centimeters of frozen water. Primitive? Absolutely effective, often enough to make a difference. For all its surprising benefits, ice armor had limits, serious limits, and the Eastern Front was ruthless in exposing them. The first major flaw appeared when temperatures rose even slightly. An armored vehicle that relied on frozen protection could suddenly find its defensive layer melting off in sheets. Tanks that had spent hours icing themselves up would begin to drip, sweat, and shed their armor like a reptile molting in the sun. Within minutes, the carefully constructed shell vanished. Crews described the experience with bitter humor. "We built our armor in 8 hours, and the sun destroyed it in 20 minutes. But the more dangerous weakness wasn't the weather, it was firepower. German anti-tank rifles like the Panzer Buchse 39 didn't care about ice. Their high-velocity rounds punched straight through the frozen crust and into the steel beneath. And anti-tank guns, the Pak-36, Pak-38, and especially the Pak-40, obliterated ice armor entirely. A single hit shattered the frozen shell into a cloud of glittering shards, leaving the tank as vulnerable as ever. Tanks coated with mud ice composites sometimes held up a little better, but even those fell apart under sustained fire. The third issue was mobility. If the ice layer froze unevenly around the tracks or suspension, the tank risked immobilizing itself. Crews had to be careful to keep the running gear clear, but in combat conditions this wasn't always possible. There were even cases of tanks becoming stuck to the frozen ground because leaking water from the armor ritual pooled under them and froze solid overnight. The most frightening failure mode came when hatches froze shut. If a crew needed to bail out, after a penetrating hit or an internal fire, they might find their only exit sealed under several centimeters of ice. Some crews prepared axes inside the tank. Others kept small charges or flares. Everyone knew that an iced tank could turn from protection to prison in seconds. So, yes, ice armor worked, but it also failed. And these failures mattered just as much as its successes, because in the end, no amount of frozen water could fully compensate for superior firepower and better designed armor. The ice armor trick didn't survive past the winter of 1941-42. As temperatures warmed and battlefields shifted, the idea became obsolete, but its legacy lived on, not in its exact form, but in the lessons it taught. The first lesson was improvisation matters. Soldiers realized that a material didn't need to be strong to be useful. It just needed to change the physics of an incoming shot. Ice didn't stop bullets by brute force. It disrupted them, redirected them, absorbed energy unevenly, much like early spaced armor concepts. And that idea, the concept of making the enemy's projectile behave unpredictably, shows up later in far more advanced designs. Composite armor, rubber layers, explosive reactive tiles, slat and cage armor, even modern camouflage that uses reflective surfaces to blend into snowy terrain. These innovations rely on the same principle that ice armor demonstrated in its crude way. A cheap, unconventional layer can dramatically alter enemy effectiveness. Another legacy was psychological. A frozen tank looked unnatural, ghostly, hard to read. It made infantry hesitate, and hesitation in war is a weapon all its own. Modern militaries continue to explore deception, thermal masking, snow-adaptive coatings, even shape-altering camouflage, all echoing the same instinct that drove those Soviet crews to pour water on their tanks in the dark. No one will ever again armor a tank with ice. But the idea that sparked the trick, the belief that a soldier can reshape the battlefield with the tools at hand, remains as relevant today as it was in that frozen winter 8 decades ago. The ice armor was never meant to be a miracle solution. It was a stopgap, a desperate measure in a desperate moment. But sometimes history is written in these moments, when survival depends not on factory steel, but on the ingenuity of the people inside the machine. Beyond the physics, beyond the battlefield improvisation, beyond the tactical advantage, there's a human story at the heart of the ice armor trick. Imagine the routine these soldiers lived through. It's midnight, the temperature is 30 degrees or worse. The wind is slicing through your coat like needles. Your hands are numb, your breath crystallizes the moment it leaves your lips, and you're standing beside a tank, pouring bucket after bucket of freezing water over its steel hide. The water splashes onto your boots and instantly freezes. The metal you touch burns your skin with cold. Your gloves stiffen. Your sleeves turn to crust. Some crews joked that they were armoring the tank by destroying themselves. Others cursed the cold so viciously that their breath came out as clouds of steam, illuminated by their lanterns. But they kept working because they had no choice. These were men who had been fighting for months, who slept in snowbanks, who hadn't seen warmth in weeks. For them, the ice armor wasn't a trick, it was hope. A thin promise that tomorrow's bullets might deflect instead of pierce, that one more ambush might be survivable, that their machine, their only shield, might stand just a little longer. Some wrote in diaries about how surreal the tanks looked after icing. As if, one tanker wrote, we had turned our machines into monuments before we ourselves were gone. That line survived, scribbled in a notebook found months later when the snow melted. Because that's what the ice armor was, an act of survival in a world turning to ice, a defiant gesture against a winter that killed without mercy. A reminder that even in mechanized war, the human spirit is the last line of defense. In the end, the ice armor did not win battles. It didn't turn Soviet tanks into invulnerable machines, and it didn't survive beyond that brutal winter. But it did something far more human. It bought time, it saved lives, and it stands today as a testament to how ingenuity can bloom even in the harshest conditions imaginable. A few centimeters of frozen water, applied by hand in the dark by exhausted soldiers standing in the snow. For a moment, it bent the rules of war. And now, 8 decades later, we remember not because it was perfect, but because it was desperate, improvised, and real. If you want to explore more forgotten battlefield inventions and unbelievable wartime improvisations, make sure you're subscribed. There are dozens of stories like this, strange, hidden, and waiting to be uncovered. Thank you for watching. Stay warm and stay curious.